Just before midnight, a tired father walked into a roadside diner with a limping German shepherd, and three armed men made the worst mistake of their lives by ignoring him completely. Tonight, one woman is carrying evidence that can bring down an empire. Three killers are already inside, and the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave is a man nobody noticed and a dog that never barked. If you're watching this, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and follow this story to the very end. Let's see how far this one travels. The diner was the kind of place that existed outside of time. No franchise sign, no loyalty app. Just a hand-painted board nailed above the door that said, Mercer's Stop in faded red letters. Though the family who'd originally owned it had sold out a decade ago to a Greek man named Theo, who'd kept the name because he couldn't afford new paint. The parking lot was cracked asphalt under a skin of old ice, and the fluorescent light above the entrance flickered in a rhythm that might have been Morse code for turnaround and find somewhere else. Nathan Mercer pulled his truck off the highway just before 11:40 and sat in the cab for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. In the passenger seat, Atlas lifted his head. He was 9 years old, which was old for a working dog, and practically ancient for one who'd spent 6 of those years doing what Atlas had done. His muzzle had gone silver. His left hip had a long-ago injury that made him favor his rear leg on cold nights, and tonight was very cold. But his eyes were the same, dark amber still, and containing something that was difficult to name if you hadn't spent years working beside an animal that seemed to understand the shape of a room before you walked into it. "Yeah," Nathan said. "I know, I'm tired too." He clipped the leash to Atlas's harness, not because the dog needed it, but because diners tended to be less hostile about animals when they were visibly restrained, and climbed out into the wind. The cold hit him like a door swinging open. He was wearing a canvas jacket that wasn't quite warm enough, and jeans with a fraying cuff, and he had the look of a man who'd stopped worrying about his appearance sometime around the first year of doing everything alone. 35. Dark hair growing out past where it should have been cut, a jaw that needed attention. He had his daughter's drawing folded in his jacket pocket, a crayon horse she'd made him that morning and pressed into his hand at the door like it was a talisman. "Come back safe, Daddy." She was 6. She still believed drawings could protect people. He held the door for a woman coming out with takeout bags, and she thanked him without looking up, already scrolling her phone. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee that had been burning since morning and something fried. Potatoes, maybe, or onions. And the heat hit him in a wave that made his eyes water slightly after the cold outside. There were 6 booths along the window wall, a counter with 8 stools, and a laminated menu tucked behind the napkin holder that hadn't changed since the building had a different name. A waitress with a silver braid and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead came around the counter. Her name tag said Ruth in black marker. She looked at Atlas, started to say something, then looked at Nathan's face and reconsidered. "Booth at the end," she said. "Away from the kitchen. And he stays on the floor." "Yes, ma'am." "You want coffee?" "Please." He settled into the last booth facing the door, which was not a habit he'd ever been able to shake, and he'd tried because his therapist had once pointed out that sitting with your back to an entrance was a thing that ordinary people did without thinking twice, and that the inability to do so was worth examining. He'd examined it and decided it wasn't worth changing. Atlas lay down under the table, put his head on Nathan's boot, and exhaled. 3 other tables were occupied. A trucker at the counter, wide-shouldered, eating a plate of eggs with the focused efficiency of a man on a schedule. An older couple in the second booth, sharing a piece of pie and not talking, but in the way of people who'd been talking to each other for 40 years and didn't need to anymore. And in the booth across from Nathan's, a young woman sitting alone with a laptop bag and a leather satchel she'd placed on the inside of the booth between herself and the wall. Nathan ordered a patty melt he didn't entirely want and a side of fries and sat looking at his phone. He had 7 texts from his sister-in-law, Pam, who was watching his daughter for the night. The last one said, "Lily's asleep finally. Took 3 books and a negotiation, the nightlight. You're welcome." He typed back a thank you and a heart emoji, something he'd started doing after Lily pointed out that he never used emojis and that this made him seem sad. He was watching a video about brake pad replacement on his phone, trying to figure out whether he could do it himself or whether he'd have to swallow the cost of a shop, when the woman across from him knocked her coffee mug off the table. It shattered. She said a word under her breath that wasn't particularly ladylike, and Ruth appeared from somewhere with a rag and a look of practiced calm. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, already crouching to help pick up the pieces. "Honey, I've cleaned up worse in the last hour alone. Sit down before you cut yourself." The woman sat back. She looked... Nathan noticed this without meaning to, the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit. She looked like someone who'd been holding herself together through the specific act of concentration, and the dropped mug had briefly interrupted that concentration, and she was now very carefully reassembling it. Late 20s, maybe 30, dark hair pulled back in a way that had been neat several hours ago and wasn't anymore. A coat that was expensive but wrinkled, like she'd been wearing it too long. She had the bone structure of someone who appeared in magazine profiles, and she was sitting in a roadside diner outside Milwaukee at 1:45 looking at her laptop screen with the expression of a person reading something that frightened them. Nathan went back to his brake pad video. Ruth brought his food. He ate mechanically, thinking about the morning. He had to drop Lily at school by 8 and then drive 40 minutes to a site in Racine where he was managing a crew doing foundation work on a commercial build, and there was a supply delivery he needed to be there for, and the truck's brakes needed to be looked at, and he owed Pam a dinner for the 3rd time this month. Atlas shifted under the table. It was a small movement. His head came off Nathan's boot, and his body oriented slightly, the way a compass needle orients. Not dramatically, not with any obvious alertness, just a quiet repositioning that meant something had changed in the information the dog was receiving. Nathan didn't look up from his phone, but his thumb stopped moving. The door opened at 11:52. 3 men came in together. This was the first thing. People who came into a diner together after midnight tended to be families on road trips, or friend groups who'd been out somewhere, or couples. These 3 had none of that energy. They moved with the specific arrangement of people who'd talked about how to move before they got out of the car. One ahead, one to the left, one trailing. They were dressed ordinarily, one in a Carhartt jacket, one in a dark fleece, one in a puffy vest. All of them wearing caps, all of them in their 30s or 40s. The one in the lead had the build of someone who worked outdoors, which was not unusual at this hour in this part of Wisconsin. The one in the fleece wore gloves, which was reasonable given the temperature. He didn't take them off when he sat down. Ruth came out from behind the counter. "What can I get for you, gentlemen?" "Coffee," said the one in the Carhartt jacket. 3. She wrote it down. The man said nothing else. None of them opened the menus she'd placed on the table. Atlas had not moved again. He was lying perfectly still, but Nathan could feel the change in the dog's body through the sole of his boot, a particular kind of stillness that was not relaxation. It was the opposite of relaxation. It was a held breath. Nathan ate a fry. He looked at his phone. He did not look at the 3 men. Okay, he thought. He'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do when you'd identified a threat was to let them know you'd identified them. The moment they understood they'd been made, the timeline collapsed. You lost the only advantage you had, which was that they still thought the room was what it appeared to be. So he ate his fry. He looked at his phone. He shifted slightly in his seat, turning so his right hand was on his lap and not on the table. The woman across the room had noticed the men. He could tell because she'd stopped typing. Her eyes came up briefly, went back down, and then the rhythm of her typing changed. Shorter keystrokes, less focused, the pattern of someone who was pretending to work. She knew. Or she suspected something, which was not the same thing, but was getting there. The man in the fleece with the gloves said something low to the man beside him. Nathan caught one word: confirm. Then the 3rd man, the one who'd come in last, got up from the booth with his coffee untouched and walked to the back of the diner, past the restrooms, toward the rear exit, checking the exit. There it is, Nathan thought. He pulled out his phone and typed a text that said nothing, just a string of random characters, and held the phone up as though reading something. The camera was facing slightly right. In the small rectangle of the screen, he could see the booth where the woman was sitting. Her hand, he could see now, was pressed flat on top of the leather satchel. Not gripping it, just touching it, the way you touch something when you needed to know it was still there. Ruth came around with a coffee refill and stopped at Nathan's table. He looked up at her. She was in her 60s, he guessed, the kind of woman who'd been working this shift long enough to know when a table was wrong. "You doing okay, hun?" she asked. Her voice was normal. Her eyes were not asking about him. "All good," he said. He glanced very briefly toward the woman's booth, then back at Ruth. Ruth gave a small nod. She moved on. Atlas put his head back on Nathan's boot. But Nathan could feel the dog tracking, not moving, just tracking, the way he'd been trained to do, cataloging everybody in the room, mapping it in some interior language that Nathan had spent years learning to read. The woman closed her laptop. She was preparing to leave. She probably thought she could walk out the front, get to her car, be gone before anything happened. It was the logical move. Except she didn't know about the third man who'd gone to check the rear exit and hadn't come back, which meant he was outside, at the car, or at both. They'd planned the geometry of this before they arrived. Nathan ate the last of his patty melt. He drank his coffee. He set down his mug with the specific care of a man who was about to need both hands, and he reached down and touched Atlas on the side of his neck. One slow stroke, nothing that would look like a signal from across the room. But Atlas knew. The woman stood up from her booth, pulling her satchel across her body, reaching for her coat. She was moving too fast. Her hands weren't quite steady. The man in the Carhartt jacket stood up at the same time. "Miss Hale," he said. Not loudly, just loud enough for her to hear. "We just need to talk to you for a minute." She stopped. Her face, when she turned toward him, showed someone who'd been hoping she was wrong and wasn't. "I don't know who you are," she said. "That's okay," he said. "We know who you are. Sit down, please." "I'm not going to sit down." "We're not asking." The trucker at the counter had gone very still. The older couple in the second booth had stopped mid-conversation. Ruth had appeared in the kitchen doorway and then immediately disappeared, which meant she'd already moved to the back, which meant she'd seen enough to call someone. Nathan hoped she had good cell service. The man in the fleece had moved around to the woman's left side, cutting her off from the door. The second man, the one who'd gone to the back, had returned through the kitchen, which told Nathan the back exit was already covered from outside, because this man's job was now interior. He was currently standing 12 feet to Nathan's right, between the kitchen and the counter, and he hadn't looked at Nathan once. That was the detail that had first told Nathan something was wrong. None of them had looked at him. Most people, when they entered a room with only a few other occupants, made at least glancing eye contact. It was reflexive, social confirmation that you'd been seen and weren't a threat. These three men had come in, identified Victoria Hale, mapped the room, and filed Nathan Mercer under not relevant with the efficiency of people who'd assessed him and moved on. It was an easy assessment to make. He understood that. He was sitting alone in a booth with a limping old dog, eating a patty melt and watching YouTube videos, wearing a jacket that had paint on the sleeve from a job 2 weeks ago. He looked like what he was, a worn-out working dad who'd stopped somewhere on a long drive home. They had no idea. "Last chance," the man in the Carhartt jacket said to the woman. "We can do this here or outside. Outside's colder." "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was steady. He gave her credit for that. "What's in the bag?" he said. She looked at him. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The files, Ms. Hale. The documentation your compliance officer sent you before she had her accident." He put a slight pause before the word accident, just enough to make clear it wasn't one. "We know you have them. We know you're not going to the police tonight because you don't know who to trust yet. We're here to make that easier for you." Victoria Hale stood very still. Nathan watched her in his peripheral vision, tracking her the same way Atlas was tracking the room. She was scared. Of course she was scared. But underneath the fear there was something else, a set of her jaw, a particular flatness in her eyes, that told him she'd been scared before and hadn't done the easy thing then either. "The documentation goes to the federal office," she said quietly. "Tonight. Whatever you do to me, it's already going." "That's a brave thing to say," the man said. He reached inside his Carhartt jacket, Nathan Mercer put 2 fingers against Atlas's right shoulder. The dog didn't move, didn't make a sound, just lifted his head a 1/4 inch from the floor and his amber eyes fixed on a point across the room with the absolute and terrifying focus of an animal that had been waiting very patiently for permission. The man's hand came out of his jacket. Nathan's hand came off the table, and Atlas was already moving. Atlas crossed the diner floor in absolute silence. That was the thing people never understood about trained canine work until they saw it. The dogs in movies barked. They snarled and showed teeth and announced themselves like furry alarm systems. Real working dogs, the ones who'd spent years doing the actual job, had learned that silence was a weapon. A barking dog told you where it was. A silent dog was already there. The man in the Carhartt jacket had his hand coming out of his jacket when 90 pounds of German Shepherd arrived at his center of gravity and introduced itself. He went down hard, his elbow cracking against the edge of the booth seat on the way, and the thing that had been in his hand, a collapsible baton, not a gun, which told Nathan something about how they'd wanted this to go, skittered across the linoleum and came to rest under a stool at the counter. The man in the fleece moved fast, faster than Nathan had expected, and reached inside his own jacket. Nathan was already out of the booth. He crossed the distance in 3 steps, caught the man's wrist before the hand cleared the fabric, and redirected it. Not a punch, not a Hollywood takedown, just precise mechanical pressure applied to the joint in a way that made continuing to move in that direction a very poor option. The man made a sound. Nathan pushed him backward into the booth divider, and the man sat down because his body told him to. "Don't," Nathan said quietly. The third man, the one who'd come back through the kitchen, was the problem. He'd positioned himself well, which meant he'd done this before. He was between Nathan and the door, and he had better angles than either of his partners. And he was now pulling a phone to his ear instead of reaching for a weapon, which meant he was calling someone outside. Atlas, having put the first man on the floor, had not bitten him. He was standing over him with his muzzle 6 inches from the man's face. The man was very still and looking at the ceiling. "Atlas, bleeb," Nathan said. "Stay." He looked at the third man. "Put the phone down." "You have no idea what you're getting into," the man said. He was calm. That was more concerning than if he'd been angry. "Phone," Nathan said again. "There are 3 more people in the parking lot. You've got maybe 2 minutes before this gets a lot more complicated." He said it the way someone reads a weather report, not a threat so much as information he thought Nathan should have. Victoria Hale was standing against the far wall near the register. She had her satchel held against her chest with both arms, and she was watching Nathan with an expression he'd seen before, the specific look of someone recalculating everything they'd thought they understood about a situation. "Is that true?" she asked. Her eyes were on Nathan. "Probably," he said. He hadn't looked away from the third man. "Then we need to leave." "Working on it." Ruth appeared from the back, phone in her hand. "Police are coming. I told them the highway exit." "How long?" Nathan asked. "They said 8 minutes, maybe 10. The third man smiled slightly. "That's too long." He was right, and all of them in the room understood it. 2 minutes versus 10 meant 8 minutes of exposure that Nathan didn't have a good answer for. Not in a diner with glass walls and a parking lot that was already compromised. Nathan looked at the man on the floor under Atlas. He was holding his elbow and not trying to move. The man whose wrist Nathan had bent was sitting in the booth and breathing carefully and also not moving. The third man was the variable. "Here's what's going to happen," Nathan said. "You're going to step to your left and sit at the counter. You're going to keep your phone on the surface where I can see it, and you're going to stay there until the police arrive." "And if I don't?" Nathan didn't answer that. He just looked at the man in a way that had, over the course of his career, communicated more than words would have. The man looked back at him. He was reading Nathan the same way Nathan was reading him, measuring, calculating. Nathan knew what the man was seeing. A tired-looking civilian in a paint-stained jacket with no visible weapon. He also knew that something in the way Nathan was standing was causing the man to revise that assessment. After a moment, the man took 1 step left and sat at the counter. He put his phone on the surface. Nathan said, "Victoria, go to the back with Ruth." "The back exit. Ruth." He didn't raise his voice. "Is there a walk-in? Pantry?" Storage room, Ruth said. No windows, steel door. Take her there. Lock it from inside. Don't open it unless you hear a police radio. Understood? Ruth nodded once with the practicality of a woman who'd survived 60-some years by understanding which situations required argument and which didn't. She put her hand on Victoria's arm. Victoria didn't move immediately. She was looking at Nathan. Who are you? Nathan Mercer. I do foundation work in Racine. That's not what Go, he said. Please. She went. He heard the steel door at the back of the diner close. The third man at the counter was watching him with that same calm expression, and now his phone buzzed on the counter surface. Once, twice, and neither of them moved toward it. Your people outside are going to come in when nobody responds, Nathan said. Yes. How many? The man smiled again. You're not a contractor. I am, actually. Residential and commercial. Nathan moved to where the baton had slid under the counter stool and picked it up, keeping his eyes up. How many people outside? The man said nothing. Nathan hadn't expected him to. He was buying time, and so was the man on the other side of the counter, and both of them knew it, and the clock was running, and the only question was what would come through the door first. The police or the 3 additional people the man had mentioned? It was not the police. The front door opened at what Nathan estimated was about 90 seconds after the third man had sat down. One person came through it and stopped when they saw the room, specifically when they saw Atlas, who had remained standing over the man on the floor with the focused patience of an animal that understood it was doing important work. The person in the doorway was a woman, somewhere around 40, wearing a dark jacket, and she had the same quality of controlled movement that the other 3 men had. Too deliberate, too mapped. She took in the scene in about a second and a half, and her hand went to her hip. Don't, Nathan said. He still had the baton. It wasn't a gun. He was aware of that. She looked at the man at the counter. He gave her something with his eyes. Nathan couldn't read what. And she looked back at Nathan and made a decision. We don't want you, she said. This isn't your business. You made it my business when you walked in here. We just need what she's carrying. She gives us the drive. Everyone goes home. She's not here. The woman's jaw tightened. We know she didn't leave. Then you know she's somewhere in this building you can't currently access, and the police are... He checked nothing, just said a number. 6 minutes out. So whatever you thought tonight was going to be, it's not that anymore. The man on the floor under Atlas said from his position staring at the ceiling, Renata, call it. The woman, Renata, looked at him, then at Nathan, then at the third man at the counter, who gave her a very small head shake. Something passed between the 3 of them that Nathan didn't have the context to fully read, but the shape of it was familiar. The moment when a plan that had seemed airtight stopped being airtight, and people had to decide how much exposure they were willing to absorb. This isn't finished, Renata said. She was talking to Nathan, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, toward the back of the diner. It is for tonight, Nathan said. She held the position for another 2 seconds, long enough to establish that she was choosing to leave and not being forced to, which was its own kind of message. And then she stepped back through the door and was gone. Nathan counted to 3. Then he said, Atlas, fuss, heel. The dog stepped back from the man on the floor and came to Nathan's left side and sat. The man on the floor let out a long breath and put his arm over his eyes. The police arrived in 4 minutes, not 6, which Nathan credited to the highway being empty at that hour. 2 county units, blue lights painting the wet asphalt in the parking lot. Nathan was at the counter with the baton on the surface in front of him and his hands visible when the first officer came through the door. It took a while to sort out. These things always did. There was a period of everyone talking at once, then a period of nobody talking at all while IDs were checked and statements were started. And Nathan sat in his original booth with Atlas under the table and his coffee gone cold and gave a deputy named Carstairs the simplified version of what had happened. Victoria came out of the storage room when Ruth opened it from the outside. She was pale and she had her arms crossed over the satchel, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment looking at the diner, at the 2 men who were now sitting with their wrists zip-tied to the booth rail, at the scattered napkins and the cracked mug from earlier that nobody had swept up yet. at Nathan in his booth. She walked over and sat down across from him. They didn't speak right away. Ruth brought 2 fresh cups of coffee without being asked and set them down and went back to dealing with the officers. "You said you do foundation work," Victoria said. "I do. In Racine. Mostly, sometimes further." She looked at him. Up close, she was more exhausted than she'd seemed from across the diner. The kind of tired that didn't come from one long night, but from a longer accumulation of nights. There were shadows under her eyes that makeup had mostly covered at some point and wasn't covering anymore. "Who trained you?" she asked. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "The Navy, initially, then a unit that didn't have a lot of paperwork." "How long?" 11 years. She was quiet for a moment. "And now you pour concrete." "Foundation work is more than concrete," he said. "But yeah, why?" It was the kind of question people asked when they were processing something, not because they needed the answer. He'd been asked it before, by different people in different contexts, and he'd given different versions of the answer depending on what seemed useful. The true version was complicated and not something he talked about in diners at midnight with people he'd just met. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 6. She made me a drawing of a horse this morning and made me take it with me." He paused. "You can't do what I used to do and also be the person she needs to come home every night. So." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Atlas. The dog was watching her with that ancient, patient attention. "He's remarkable," she said. "He's tired and his hip hurts, and he'd like to go home." Nathan finished his coffee. "Can you tell me what's on that drive?" Her hands tightened on the satchel. "Why?" "Because the woman who left through the front door wasn't done. She said this isn't finished, and she meant it. And if you're planning to hand what you have to federal investigators, you need to make it there first." He set down his mug. "So I need to understand what we're dealing with." Victoria looked at the 2 officers still working the room, taking photos, writing things down. Then she looked back at Nathan. "My company is called Hale Meridian," she said. "Freight and logistics. My father built it. He died 14 months ago and left it to me, which went over about as well as you'd expect with a board that had worked with my father for 20 years and had opinions about whether a 30-year-old woman should be running a company with $400 million in annual contracts." She said it flatly, without self-pity, like she was reading from a document. 8 months ago, our compliance officer, her name is Sandra Oren, flagged anomalies in 6 of our government contracts, billing irregularities, significant ones. She brought them to me privately because she'd already tried the internal audit channel and been told the irregularities were within acceptable parameters, which they were not. "What kind of contracts?" "Federal freight, Department of Defense supply chain logistics, mostly. The irregularities were in the margin structures, the ways of billing that looked legal on the surface, but were generating undisclosed income flowing out of the company through shell structures." She paused. "Sandra was hit by a car 2 weeks ago. She's alive, but she's in a rehabilitation facility in Sheboygan, and she can't walk. The police called it a hit and run." Nathan said nothing. He waited. "She'd sent me copies of everything before the accident. She said she had a feeling. I didn't know what to do with that at the time." Victoria's jaw was tight. "I took the files to the only person outside the company I trusted, which was a former colleague at a consulting firm. He was helping me verify the documentation and figure out who in the federal system I could approach safely. He told me 3 days ago that he'd been contacted, warned off, and that he thought his office was being monitored." She set her hand flat on the satchel again. "The drive has all of it. The original files Sandra gave me, 6 months of my colleagues' analysis, and documentation of 3 board members we believe are directly involved in structuring the fraud." "Damian Vaughn," Nathan said. She looked at him sharply. "How do you—" "The man on the floor. When the woman came in, Renata, he told her to call it. Right before that, when she came through the door, he looked at her in a specific way, like someone who was deciding something about the mission. That kind of call doesn't come from hired contractors. It comes from someone with enough authority in the operation to greenlight a retreat." He shook his head slightly. "I don't know it's Vaughn. I'm guessing from your reaction." Victoria let out a breath. "He's been on the board for 11 years. He was my father's closest business partner." She said it with a flatness that covered something. He was at my father's funeral. He told me—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter what he told me." "It matters to you," Nathan said. She looked at him. She didn't answer. Outside, a third police unit had pulled up, and Nathan could see through the window that a detective was talking to Carstairs, gesturing toward the diner. They'd be coming back in soon, and the conversation would change character. "The federal contact you were planning to reach tonight," Nathan said. "Is that still viable?" "Her name is Agent Miriam Cho. She's with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Chicago. I've spoken to her twice by phone. She doesn't know what I have yet. I was supposed to meet her assistant tomorrow morning." Victoria looked at her watch. "This morning, in 5 hours. Can you reach her directly, not through an assistant?" "I have a number she gave me, for emergencies." "This is an emergency." "I know that." She was looking at him with that recalculating expression again. "I also know that the woman who left this diner is not going to wait for me to make a phone call. She knows I'm still here. She knows the police have 2 of her people. She's going to regroup." "Yes. And the surveillance? If they tracked me here, they can track me to wherever I go next." "Yes. So what do you suggest?" Nathan looked at the window, at the police lights, the parking lot, the highway beyond, empty in both directions. He thought about Lily asleep at Pam's house, probably with the nightlight she'd negotiated for. He thought about the brake pads on his truck. He thought about the woman named Sandra Oren in a rehabilitation facility in Sheboygan who'd had a feeling and had been right about it. "I suggest you call Agent Cho right now," he said. "From Ruth's landline, if there is one, not your cell." He looked at her. "And then we figure out how to get you to Chicago without anyone knowing which direction you went." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to do this. You stopped what happened here tonight. That was already— You didn't have to do that, and you did, and I'm not—" She stopped. Tried again. "You have a daughter." "I know I have a daughter. I'm saying you don't owe me anything." Nathan sat back in the booth. Under the table, Atlas had put his head on his boot again. Outside, the detective was heading toward the door. "Sandra Oren had a feeling," he said. "She put everything on a drive and sent it to you before someone put her in a rehabilitation facility." He looked at Victoria. "That drive doesn't get where it's going. What happened to her doesn't mean anything. And you're sitting in a diner with 2 of their people in zip ties and 3 more somewhere outside and a phone in your bag you shouldn't use." He stood up. "So yeah, I'm going to help you get to Chicago." She opened her mouth and closed it. "Ruth," Nathan called toward the counter. The silver-braided woman looked up from where she was talking to an officer. "Do you have a landline?" "In the back," Ruth said. "Hasn't worked right since March, but it works." "Close enough," Nathan said. He looked at the detective coming through the door and gave him a nod that said, "We'll get to you in a minute," and the detective, reading something in Nathan's posture that suggested this was a man who didn't need to be managed, nodded back and went to talk to Carstairs first. Victoria stood up. She had the satchel strap over her shoulder, and she looked, in the fluorescent light of the diner, like someone who'd had a plan and then had it come apart, and was now operating on something rawer and less comfortable than a plan. She looked like someone trying to decide whether to trust a stranger. "My car is in the lot," she said. "They know what it looks like." "We take my truck." "What about Atlas's hip? You said—" "He'll manage." Nathan looked down at the dog. "He always manages." Atlas looked back up at him with those amber eyes. There was something in the dog's expression that Nathan had no word for. Not simple loyalty, which was too small, and not intelligence, which was too human, but something that lived in the space between. 9 years of working together had created a particular kind of understanding that didn't require language. The dog stood up, favored the left hip briefly when his weight settled, then straightened. "Okay," Victoria said quietly. She sounded like someone stepping off a ledge in the dark and not knowing how far down it went. "Okay." They went to the back to use Ruth's landline. The detective would wait another few minutes. The 2 men in zip ties weren't going anywhere. Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond the parking lot lights, Renata and whoever was with her were making their own calculations about what came next. The night wasn't close to finished. Nathan had known that since the moment Atlas lifted his head from his boot. What he hadn't known, what he was only beginning to understand as he walked through the kitchen of a roadside diner outside Milwaukee at nearly 1 in the morning with a woman carrying evidence that frightened serious people, was how long the night was going to be and how much ground they'd have to cover before anything resembling morning felt real. He'd told Lily he'd be home in the morning. He'd meant it when he said it. He still meant it. He just wasn't sure yet what morning meant in this context. What hour, what road, what version of home he'd be returning to when this was over. Atlas walked at his left heel without a limp, which was what Atlas always did when it mattered. Agent Miriam Cho picked up on the third ring. It was 12:47 in the morning, and she answered like someone who hadn't been asleep. Quick, alert, no fumbling, which told Nathan something about the kind of person she was before Victoria had spoken a word into Ruth's landline receiver. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the storage room, giving Victoria enough space to talk privately while keeping eyes on the back exit. Atlas sat beside him, ears moving independently the way they did when the dog was processing sound from multiple directions. The call lasted 6 minutes. Nathan listened to Victoria's half of it. Short answers, careful language, the specific economy of someone who'd been told by a lawyer at some point to say only what was necessary. When she hung up, she stood holding the receiver for a moment before setting it back in the cradle. "She wants me in Chicago by 6, Victoria said. "Federal building on Dearborn. She's pulling in 2 of her people tonight." "That's good." "She also said—" Victoria paused. "She said my phone has likely been cloned, that I shouldn't use it for anything." "Leave it here," Nathan said, "or give it to one of the officers. Either way, not in the truck." She looked at the phone in her hand. Not the landline, but her own, which she'd taken out of her coat pocket. It was a good phone. Expensive. He could see the screen had a photo of what looked like a terrace somewhere warm, which was not where she currently was. She set it on Ruth's storage shelf without saying anything else about it. They gave statements to Detective Rourke, who was thorough and not easily managed, and who asked Nathan 3 times in different formulations what exactly his training background was and what exactly he'd done to the man whose wrist had required ice from Ruth's freezer. Nathan answered each version of the question the same way, calmly and with the same words, which was a thing he'd learned produced better outcomes than varying the language. Rourke let them go at 1:15. He made it clear he'd need them available and that leaving the state would be a problem. Nathan said he understood. They walked out through the diner. The 2 men had been taken to separate cars. The broken mug had been swept up. Ruth was at the counter with a fresh pot of coffee and a look on her face that suggested she'd been through enough unusual nights in this building that she'd developed a philosophy about them. "Thank you," Nathan said to her. "Don't thank me," Ruth said. "Just don't come back here and bring whatever this was with you." She said it without heat. Then she looked at Atlas. "He can come back?" Outside, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped another 2 degrees. Nathan's truck was a 2019 F250 dark blue, with a crew cab and a toolbox in the bed and a car seat in the back that he'd moved to the middle to make room for Victoria's satchel. He opened the passenger door and Atlas went in first, slowly, the hip working against the cold, and settled across the back seat. Victoria got in. She sat with the satchel on her lap and looked at the diner through the passenger window as Nathan pulled out of the lot. "Rourke is going to call someone," she said, "about where we're going." "Probably." Nathan checked his mirrors. The lot was down to 1 police unit and a tow truck working on Victoria's car, which had 2 flat tires that nobody was pretending were accidental anymore. Which is why we're not going directly to Chicago. "Where are we going?" "Kenosha. I know a motel that doesn't ask questions and takes cash. We stop there, we wait for 4 o'clock, and we make the drive when it's still dark and the traffic on 94 is thin." He glanced at her. "And I need to call my sister-in-law and tell her something that isn't entirely a lie." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to tell her?" "That I got caught up with something and I'll be home by noon." He paused. "Which is true if everything goes right." She seemed to understand there was uncertainty embedded in that statement and chose not to push on it. The highway was empty. Southbound 94 unspooled ahead of them in the headlights, the road surface wet from a light rain that had started and stopped and was now starting again. Nathan drove at a steady 5 over the limit, fast enough to cover ground, slow enough not to invite attention from the 1 or 2 state units that might be running this stretch at 2 in the morning. "Tell me about Vaughn," he said, after they'd been driving for about 10 minutes. Victoria looked at her hands on the satchel. "What do you want to know?" Sandra Orrin's documentation names him directly. 3 of the 6 shell structures route back to an entity he controls. Not his name anywhere in the paperwork. It's all layered through a holding company in Delaware and then another level in the Caymans. But Sandra's analysis traced it. She had 22 years of forensic accounting before she came to work for us. A beat. She's very good at what she does. How long has the fraud been running? Sandra estimated at least 7 years. Possibly longer, but the documentation she could access only went back 7. Victoria shifted the satchel slightly. The numbers they're not small. The aggregate over 7 years, with the margin structures compounded, is somewhere between $60 and $90 million. Nathan didn't whistle. He just absorbed it. And the other 2 board members? Crane and Aldis. They're not as deeply embedded as Vaughn. Sandra's read was that they knew and approved, but weren't architects of it. Vaughn built the structure. They just took distributions and didn't ask questions. Does Vaughn know specifically what's on that drive? The level of detail? Victoria looked at him. "He's known me since I was 12 years old," she said. "He knew my father for 25 years. When my father's health was declining, Vaughn was the person who handled things. Managed the company, managed the board, managed the outside relationships." She stopped, looked back at the road. "After my father died, Vaughn took me to dinner and told me he'd always look out for me. That the company was in good hands and I didn't need to worry." She paused. "I think he believed that. I think he thought he was doing me a favor by keeping me at a comfortable distance from how the business actually operated. Until Sandra came to you." "Until Sandra came to me." Her voice was flat. "He doesn't know everything that's on the drive, but he knows enough. He knows Sandra compiled documentation. He knows she brought it to me. He knows I've been talking to someone at the FBI because they've been watching my communications for at least 2 months. She turned to look at Nathan. "He doesn't know her name. Agent Cho has been careful about that." Nathan checked his mirrors again. 3 sets of headlights behind them, well spaced, none of them gaining. He watched them for a full mile before his breathing settled back to normal. "He's going to move fast," Nathan said. "Whatever he was planning to do when they stopped you at the diner, losing that play doesn't mean he stops. It means he shifts to something else." "I know." "What's his next move if he can't intercept you?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "There's an emergency board meeting scheduled for 7 a.m. today. He called it 2 days ago. The stated purpose is reviewing Q3 financials." She paused. "I think the actual purpose is to pass a resolution removing me as CEO before I can do anything with what I have." "Can he do that?" "He has 7 of 11 votes locked. All he needs is a simple majority." She was looking at the road. "If I'm removed, any documents I've obtained potentially lose their chain of custody value. Our legal team reviewed that possibility. And without me as a named party, Agent Cho's investigation starts from a different, more complicated position. So the meeting is the real move." The people at the diner were supposed to take the drive and eliminate the most immediate risk. The meeting was always the next step. She exhaled slowly. "He's very good at this. He's been doing it for 25 years. "He made one mistake," Nathan said. She looked at him. "He assumed you'd go to the police when you got to Chicago, or at least he planned around that assumption. Enough time, enough legal delay that the board meeting would be over before anything was unsealed." Nathan checked his mirrors again. "He didn't account for you getting to Cho directly before the meeting." "We haven't gotten to Cho yet." "No," Nathan agreed. "We haven't." The motel was called the Lakeview Inn, which was optimistic given that the lake in question was several miles east and not visible from any window. It was a 2-story exterior corridor place with a neon sign that had lost its E at some point, and nobody had fixed it. Nathan paid cash at the front desk for 2 rooms, and the man working the desk, young, playing something on his phone with one hand, took the money without looking up long enough to form a memorable impression of either of them. Room 114 for Victoria. Room 116 for Nathan, directly adjacent. He walked her to the door. Atlas moved beside him, still favoring the hip but not stopping. "You should try to sleep," he said. She looked at him like the idea was in a foreign language. "I don't think—" 2 hours. Set your— He remembered. "The motel phone has an alarm. Set it for 3:45. She stood in the open doorway. The room behind her was generic and slightly cold and smelled of industrial cleaner, and the parking lot light put a yellow cast on everything that wasn't kind to either of them. "You did something in there tonight," she said. "Something you didn't have to do. Twice. And you're doing it again now." "I know. I'm trying to say thank you, and you keep just— I know what you're doing." He looked at her directly. "You don't need to. Just get some sleep." She held the door frame. "Do you do this a lot? Help people?" He thought about Pam's texts, about Lily's horse drawing in his jacket pocket, about the brake pads on his truck that still needed doing, and the delivery in Racine he was supposed to be at in approximately 6 hours. "No," he said. "This is unusual for a Tuesday." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. The exhaustion was too thick for it to fully surface. "Good night, Nathan. Good night." He went to his room. He didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed with his jacket on and his boots on, and Atlas on the floor beside him, and he thought about road geometry, the fastest routes from Kenosha to the federal building on Dearborn, the likely surveillance points, the places where you were most exposed. He thought about Renata, who had retreated from the diner with the particular composure of someone who was regrouping rather than giving up. He thought about Sandra Orrin in a rehabilitation facility in Sheboygan, relearning how to walk. At 3:40, he was already up. He knocked on Victoria's door at 3:50, and she opened it in the same clothes she'd been wearing, which meant she hadn't slept either, or had slept in what she was wearing, which was almost the same thing. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Let's go." He almost smiled. They were on 94 southbound by 4:05. The rain had come back with more intention, sheeting across the highway in gusts that rocked the truck slightly on the exposed stretches and reduced visibility to a quarter mile. Nathan ran his wipers on high and kept his speed steady and watched the mirrors with the systematic patience of someone who'd learned that the things that kill you don't announce themselves. They just appear in your peripheral vision when you've been watching the wrong place. For the first 40 minutes, nothing unusual. Then, at the interchange south of Racine, a pair of headlights appeared approximately a quarter mile back that held their distance with a precision that traffic doesn't naturally produce. Traffic either catches up or falls back. These held. Nathan changed lanes. The headlights changed lanes. He changed back. They changed back. "We have company," he said. Victoria turned to look back. "How long?" "Since the interchange, maybe before." "How many?" "One vehicle I can confirm. Probably a second one further back that I'd see if I could see further back." He looked at the rain. "The weather's actually helping. Makes it harder for them to run close surveillance without being obvious." "What do we do?" Nathan thought about it. The federal building on Dearborn was not the right destination anymore. Not if they were being followed, because arriving with a tail meant potentially compromising Cho's position and the entire morning timeline. He needed to break the tail first, which on a major interstate at 4 in the morning with limited traffic was not simple, because the same low traffic that made it easy to spot a tail made it hard to lose one. "Call Cho," he said. "Use the motel room's number." "Do you remember it?" "Room 114. The motel was Lakeview Inn, Kenosha. FBI can find the number." He glanced at her. "Tell her we're being followed, and we need an alternate meeting point, something she controls." Victoria had already picked up his truck's cab phone, the old Bluetooth handset clipped to the dash that he used for job site calls, and was doing something with it. Then she stopped. "This connects to my Bluetooth." Nathan took the handset and turned off the Bluetooth function manually, switching it to a direct call through the cab wiring. "Now it doesn't. Use the last number on the motel's landline call log. That was Cho's number." She dialed from memory. 6 rings. Then Cho's voice again, same alert quality as before. Nathan listened to Victoria's half of it. Short, efficient. Cho asked something, and Victoria described their location and direction, and Cho said something that made Victoria write a number on the back of a gas receipt from Nathan's center console. "Exit 37, Victoria said when she hung up. "There's a federal marshal's satellite office in a commercial building in Waukegan. She's calling it in. Someone will meet us there." "How long?" "She said 20 minutes to have someone there. She needs us to—" Victoria looked at the receipt. "To drive past the exit once before we take it, to see if the tail follows us past, and then doubles back." "That's good," Nathan said. "She also said—" Victoria paused. "She said to tell you that the tail vehicle is registered to a private security firm out of Indianapolis called Garrison Protective Services. She said she knows that name. She said it's important." Nathan absorbed that. "Vaughn hired them." "She said probably. She said she's been watching Garrison for 8 months in connection with a separate matter, and this—" Victoria looked at the receipt. "This," she said, "changed things. Her exact words were, 'This changes the scope.'" "Good," Nathan said again. He meant it differently this time. They passed exit 37 at 4:51. The headlights behind them passed it too, held steady, didn't even slow. And Nathan felt the specific relief of a professional confirmation. They'd just given Cho something she could use and given themselves proof of what they were dealing with. He took the next exit, looped back on the surface road, and came at exit 37 from the on-ramp. In his mirrors, no headlights followed. The commercial building was a low 2-story in an office park that had seen better years, most of the units dark at this hour. A single parking lot light above a door marked with no signage at all. A black SUV was already there, running, and a man in a dark jacket was standing outside it holding a coffee cup and looking at his phone. He looked up when Nathan's truck pulled in. He said something into a radio on his shoulder, then walked over. "Mercer?" he said through Nathan's window. "Yeah." "Deputy Marshal Tate. Agent Cho's people are 20 minutes behind me." He looked at Victoria. "Ms. Hale, you want to come inside?" They went inside. The office was sparse and fluorescent, and there was a folding table with a coffee maker that was running, and 3 chairs and a whiteboard that had a diagram on it from some previous use that nobody had erased. It felt like a room that was used for exactly this kind of thing. Not comfortable, not designed for anything beyond function. Atlas walked in, looked at the room, chose a corner, and lay down. Deputy Marshal Tate was professional and not particularly interested in conversation, which Nathan respected. He stood near the door and let them have the room. Nathan poured 2 coffees and gave one to Victoria, who took it without comment and sat in one of the folding chairs and stared at the whiteboard. "Garrison Protective Services," Nathan said, sitting across from her. "Tell me that name means something to you." She looked up. "It means something to Cho, apparently." "It should mean something to you? If Vaughn hired a private security firm with federal-level surveillance capability to track you, that's not something you improvise. That's something you set up in advance. Weeks, maybe." He held his coffee. "When did you first contact Cho?" Victoria thought. 6 weeks ago. A preliminary call. I didn't give her specifics, just told her I had documentation of potential fraud in federal contracting and asked what the proper channel was." "And Vaughn's people were watching your communications?" "Yes." "So he knew within days that you'd reached out to the FBI, and he started building a response." Nathan looked at her. "He's been 6 weeks ahead of you." She put her coffee down. "I know. Which means the board meeting at 7 isn't improvised either. He's had the votes locked for weeks. The diner was about removing the evidence and removing you before you could use it. The meeting was always going to happen regardless." "I know that too." "Then here's what I don't know," Nathan said. "Cho gets the drive. She opens an investigation. That takes time. Weeks, months before anything is unsealed or acted on formally. In that window, Vaughn runs the board meeting, removes you, and restructures whatever he can restructure." He leaned forward slightly. "Is there a way to stop the meeting?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment. The coffee maker finished its cycle and clicked off, and the silence in the room had a particular quality. Not empty, but dense, like air before a storm breaks. "If I walk into that meeting," she said slowly, "as CEO, before the vote, with federal agents present." She stopped. "Can you do that legally?" The meeting was called by a board member. As CEO, I have the right to attend any board meeting called in my company's name. I also have the right, under the company's operating agreement, to bring legal counsel or authorized representatives. She was working it through as she said it. Federal agents with a warrant, or even just with credentials and documentation indicating an ongoing federal investigation into board members. Would that stop the vote? It would stop Vaughn from wanting to take the vote. If he moves forward with removing me while federal agents are in the room with documentation linking him to fraud, every board member who votes yes becomes a potential co-defendant for obstruction. She looked at Nathan. He wouldn't take that risk. So we need to be in that room at 7. Cho would need to We need to be in that room at 7, Nathan said again, more simply. Victoria stared at him. Outside, through the one window in the room that faced the parking lot, headlights appeared. 2 vehicles, moving with purpose, federal plates. The building is in downtown Chicago, she said, 42nd floor. Vaughn will have security on the elevators. Yes. You're suggesting we walk into a building controlled by the man who tried to have me kidnapped 3 hours ago. I'm suggesting we walk into a building controlled by the man who tried to have you kidnapped 3 hours ago. Except this time we walk in with federal agents and everything he did tonight documented and in the hands of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Nathan looked at her steadily. The diner was his play. This is yours. She held his gaze. Something was moving behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that was asking whether she was the person this required her to be. Agent Miriam Cho came through the door at 5:17. She was 50-something, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had spent decades learning not to show surprise. She looked at Nathan once with a thorough professional assessment, then looked at Atlas in the corner, and then looked at Victoria. "You're in one piece," she said. Not a question. "So far," Victoria said. Cho set a briefcase on the folding table and opened it. Inside was a tablet, a portable drive reader, and a set of documents in a folder. She looked at the satchel on Victoria's lap. "Let's see what you have," she said. Victoria unzipped the front pocket of the satchel and removed the drive. It was small, a standard encrypted thumb drive, unremarkable looking, the kind of thing you'd lose in a drawer. She set it on the table between them. "Sandra Orne's complete file," Victoria said. 6 months of independent analysis, and documentation of 3 board members including Damian Vaughn. Cho picked up the drive. She looked at it the way someone looks at something they've been working toward for longer than they'd like to admit. "Ms. Hale," she said, "I'm going to need the next 30 minutes to review this with my team." She glanced at Nathan. "Mr. Mercer, there's more coffee on the table and my people bring better coffee than what's currently in that machine. Make yourself comfortable." She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The way she handled the drive, carefully with both hands, setting it into the reader with deliberate attention, set it. Nathan refilled his cup. He went and sat against the wall near Atlas and looked at the ceiling and let the adrenaline of the last 4 hours settle somewhere lower in his body where it wouldn't keep his hands tight. Atlas put his head on Nathan's knee. Nathan put his hand on the dog's neck. Through the window, the parking lot lights were beginning to be outrun by something gray and gradual in the eastern sky. Not daylight yet, but the first suggestion of it, the sky beginning to decide what it was going to be. It was 5:23 in the morning. In 97 minutes, Damian Vaughn would call a board meeting to order in a 42nd floor conference room in downtown Chicago. Nathan drank his coffee and waited and thought about nothing in particular, which was something he'd gotten good at over years of doing work that required you to be ready but not spent, available but not burning. The trick wasn't staying calm. The trick was understanding that whatever was coming was going to come, regardless of whether you tensed against it, and that tensing was just a waste. Atlas's breathing slowed and deepened beside him. Even now, the dog was resting when he could. That had always seemed to Nathan like the truest form of professionalism. Not the dramatic readiness, not the controlled aggression, but the ability to be fully off in the moments between so that you were fully on when it counted. He'd learned it from the dog. He'd never told anyone that. From the table, he heard Cho say something sharp and quiet to one of her agents. He heard the word garrison, and then a pause, and then numbers, monetary figures that climbed higher than the ones Victoria had described. which meant Cho was finding things on that drive that extended beyond what Victoria herself had known. Victoria looked at Nathan from across the room. He nodded once. She nodded back. The gray in the eastern window deepened into something that was almost color, and downtown Chicago was 40 minutes south. And the night, which had started in a roadside diner over a patty melt and a brake pad video, was finally becoming morning, which wasn't the same as being over, but was something. Cho's review of the drive took 38 minutes. Nathan knew because he watched the clock on the wall above the whiteboard, an analog clock, the kind with a sweep second hand, which he found himself tracking the way he'd tracked things in other rooms, in other circumstances. Not out of anxiety, but because the mind needed something to do while the body waited. At 5:55, Cho closed her briefcase and stood up and looked at Victoria. "Sandra Oren is a very thorough woman," she said. "Yes," Victoria said, "she is. What she compiled, combined with what my unit has been building independently on Garrison Protective Services, gives us enough for arrest warrants on Vaughn and 2 others. Crane and Aldis we can charge later. Their exposure is secondary." Cho looked at the drive in the portable reader, then removed it and handed it back to Victoria. "I want you to keep this on your person. Chain of custody." Victoria took it and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. "The board meeting," Nathan said from his position against the wall. Cho looked at him. She'd been doing that periodically during the 38 minutes, glancing over at him like she was revising something, which he understood. He didn't fit the obvious categories, and people like Cho relied on categories. "Yes," she said. "Tell me why you think we should be there." "Because the warrants take time to execute cleanly, and in that window Vaughn runs his vote. Even if you arrest him at noon, a board resolution passed at 7 this morning is still a legal instrument. Victoria gets removed, the company restructures, and whatever Vaughn's lawyers argue about the investigation's scope becomes complicated." Nathan looked at her steadily. "You walk into that room at 7 with credentials and documentation in hand, you freeze the vote. Every board member in that room who is planning to vote yes has to decide in real time whether that's still a good idea with federal agents present." Cho looked at him for a moment. "You have a background in tactical operations." "Foundation work," Nathan said. "Racine." The corner of Cho's mouth moved slightly. "The warrants will be signed by 6:30. I can have 4 agents at the building by 6:50. There's a 5th floor staging area in the building. My office uses it for financial district operations." She looked at Victoria. "You're comfortable walking in?" Victoria had that look again. The one from the motel doorway, the question of whether she was who this needed her to be. Nathan had watched her over the past 4 hours move through fear and exhaustion and arrive somewhere that was neither exactly, but was steadier than both. "He's been in my company for 7 years running this," she said. "He was at my father's funeral." She picked up her coffee, found it cold, set it back down. "Yes, I'm comfortable walking in." Cho nodded once. She turned to Deputy Marshal Tate, who'd been standing near the door the entire time with the patience of a man accustomed to long nights in rooms like this one. "Get the vehicles ready. We leave at 6:20. Nathan stood up. Atlas rose with him, shook himself once, and stood. "Mr. Mercer," Cho said. He looked at her. "You're not an agent. You're not authorized to act in any law enforcement capacity in that building." "I know." "You and the dog are there as," she considered the word, "observers. Victoria's personal support, let's say. If anything develops that requires a physical response, my people handle it." "Understood." She held his gaze another moment. "Good." She picked up her briefcase. "Though I'll note that without your involvement last night, this conversation is not happening. So." It was the closest thing to a thank you that Nathan suspected she gave, and he took it as such. They drove to Chicago in a 3-vehicle convoy, Cho's black SUV in front, Nathan's truck in the middle, a second federal vehicle behind. The rain had stopped somewhere around 5:30 and left the highways with that particular early morning gloss, everything dark and reflective and empty in a way that felt temporary. The city holding its breath before the commuter traffic arrived and filled everything back up. Victoria sat beside Nathan and didn't speak for most of the drive. She had her hand in her coat pocket, he noticed, touching the drive. "You knew about the board meeting timing," Nathan said, about 20 minutes outside Chicago. You knew he was planning to move on you today. I suspected, she said. The meeting was called on short notice. Vaughn said it was Q3 financials, but we'd already reviewed those internally. There was no reason to pull everyone in at 7 in the morning unless the agenda was something else. And you went to the diner last night to... The drive, she said. I'd been keeping it at my apartment, but after what happened to Sandra, I didn't trust my apartment anymore. I was moving it to a secondary location, a safe deposit box at a bank in Waukesha that's registered under my mother's maiden name. She paused. The diner was just where I stopped. I was tired. I'd been driving for 2 hours, and I needed coffee, and I stopped. Nathan thought about that. The whole chain of the night, her stopping, him stopping, Atlas sensing what a room full of humans had missed. The specific randomness of it. They followed you from your apartment, he said, or from somewhere along the route. They'd been watching for long enough that it wouldn't have mattered much where I stopped. They just needed me stopped somewhere with limited witnesses and a rear exit. She looked at the road. The diner probably seemed ideal. Middle of nowhere. One waitress. They didn't account for Ruth, Nathan said. Victoria made a sound that was a real laugh this time, tired and genuine. No, they did not account for Ruth. They got quiet again. Atlas was asleep across the back seat, taking the opportunity as dogs do, completely, without reservation. My father would have liked you, Victoria said after a while. She said it simply, without particular weight, like she was just saying a true thing. Nathan didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything with it. He just drove. The building was a 44-story glass tower on the northern end of the financial district, the kind that existed in clusters of other identical buildings, so that it was distinguishable only by the name on the lobby directory and the particular arrangement of its elevator banks. Hale Meridian occupied the 42nd floor. Nathan had looked at the building's address on Cho's tablet during the drive and tried to map what he knew about corporate high-rise layouts, lobby security, elevator access controls, floor-specific keycards. They staged in the underground parking structure at 648. Cho's 4th and 5th agents were already there, along with a woman in a dark pantsuit who introduced herself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Deborah Marsh, which was the first indication Nathan had that this morning had already grown significantly beyond what a single FBI financial crimes unit would typically cover. The Garrison connection expanded the scope, Cho told him quietly, while Marsh spoke with Victoria. What's on that drive touches 3 other federal investigations. This isn't just Hale Meridian anymore. Vaughn knew that? He knew it was getting there. I think that's why tonight happened. She looked toward the elevator bank. He was out of time and he knew it. The warrants had been signed at 6:27. Nathan had seen Cho's phone light up and seen her exhale. A controlled exhale, but an exhale, and understood what it meant. Marsh finished with Victoria and walked over to Nathan. She was somewhere around 45, with the composure of someone who'd argued cases in front of difficult judges and found that more useful than being warm. Agent Cho tells me you're the reason Ms. Hale is standing here, she said. Partly, Nathan said. Are you going to be a problem in that boardroom? No. She looked at him the way Cho had looked at him. Thorough, assessing. The dog goes in? Nathan looked at Atlas. He's a retired service animal. He's allowed in public buildings. That's technically, Marsh started. He also helped neutralize 4 armed individuals in a roadside diner at midnight, Cho said from beside them. So I'm comfortable with the dog. Marsh looked at Atlas. Atlas looked back at her with those amber eyes, patient and ancient, and not particularly interested in her assessment of his rights. Fine, Marsh said. Let's go. They rode up in 2 separate elevators, Cho, Marsh, and 2 agents in the first, Nathan, Victoria, Atlas, and 2 more agents in the second. The elevator was the kind with mirrored walls, and Nathan caught his reflection for the first time since the night before. The paint-stained jacket, the jaw that needed attention, the hair that needed cutting. He looked like a man who'd been awake since yesterday and was wearing it. Victoria caught his eye in the mirror. She'd done something with her hair in the parking structure bathroom, pulled it back with a purpose it hadn't had for most of the night. The coat was still wrinkled, but she wore it differently now. She wore it like she was going to work, which she was. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Ask me in an hour," she said. The elevator opened on 42. The floor had the look of a company that had been built over decades and had the money to show it. Dark wood paneling, carpet that absorbed sound. The company name in brushed steel on the wall behind the receptionist's desk. The receptionist's desk was unmanned at this hour, which meant facilities staff had unlocked the floor for the meeting, but the administrative team hadn't arrived yet. Two men in dark suits were standing at the far end of the corridor, near the glass double doors that Nathan assumed led to the conference room. They were the kind of men who stood in specific ways, weight distributed, hands not in pockets, attention directed broadly rather than at anything specific. Garrison, Nathan thought, or Vaughn's private arrangement. Either way. One of them started forward when he saw the group come off the elevator. He was looking at Cho's credentials before his feet stopped moving. "This floor is restricted for a private federal agents," Cho said and held up her badge. "We're here for the board meeting." The man looked at the badge. He looked at Cho. He looked at Nathan, specifically, which suggested he'd been given a description and was running it against what he was seeing and coming up with something that concerned him. He reached for a radio on his belt. "Don't," said the agent directly behind Cho. Not threatening, just informational. The man with the radio looked at the agent. The agent was larger than him and holding credentials of his own, and had the specific stillness of someone who was not going to change what he'd said. The man left the radio on his belt. His partner, near the conference room doors, had moved back 2 steps and was on a phone. Nathan watched his mouth and caught fragments. "They're here, there are federal." And then the call apparently ended because the man lowered the phone and stood very still, looking at the doors behind him with the expression of someone who'd just reported something and was waiting to learn what happened next. Cho walked past both of them without acknowledging them further. Marsh followed. The agents formed a practical arrangement around Victoria and Nathan that wasn't a formation exactly, but functioned as one. Nathan could hear voices behind the conference room doors. More than a few. The meeting had apparently started early, or people were already gathered. He heard one voice above the others, not loud but carrying, with the particular resonance of someone who was accustomed to having rooms arrange themselves around what he was saying. "Vaughn." Cho pushed open the conference room doors. The room was large, with a long oval table that seated 12 and currently had 9 people around it. Floor-to-ceiling windows behind the table faced north, and the Chicago skyline was doing something complicated in the early morning light. The buildings dark-sided and glass-bright simultaneously, the lake beyond them flat and gray. It was a view that cost money and communicated as much. 9 people. 8 of them Nathan didn't know. The 9th was sitting at the far end of the table, a man in his early 60s, silver-haired, in a suit that fit the way expensive suits fit, with the comfortable authority of someone who'd been the most important person in every room he'd entered for the past 20 years. He looked at the door when it opened. He saw Cho. He saw Marsh. He saw his 2 security people behind them, standing without radios in their hands. He saw Victoria. He did not look at Nathan, and then, when his gaze moved naturally past, he stopped and looked at Nathan again. Something happened in his face. It wasn't surprise. It was more controlled than surprise. It was the very rapid calculation of a man who'd built elaborate structures, understanding that one piece he hadn't accounted for had just walked through the door. "Victoria," he said. His voice was warm. That was the thing Nathan hadn't expected. How genuinely warm it was. "I'm glad you're safe. We heard about what happened last night, and I've been—" "Damien," she said. She walked into the room and stood at the near end of the table. "I'd like to introduce Agent Miriam Cho and Assistant U.S. Attorney Deborah Marsh." A man to Vaughn's left, 50s, heavy-set, the board member Nathan guessed was Crane, moved his chair back slightly. It was a small movement. Nobody else at the table would have identified it as what it was. Nathan identified it. "This is a private board," Vaughn started. "Mr. Vaughn," Marsh said. She placed her briefcase on the table and opened it. "I have federal arrest warrants for Damien Vaughn, Stuart Crane, and Paul Aldis. I also have a document preservation order covering all Hail Meridian corporate records, digital and physical, effective immediately. She removed 3 separate folded documents and placed them on the table. I'd ask you to remain seated. Nobody moved. The silence in that room had a texture Nathan had felt before. In other rooms, other moments when the weight of something shifted definitively and everyone present felt it at the same time. It wasn't drama, it was just gravity. Vaughn looked at the documents on the table. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at Victoria. I want you to understand something, he said. His voice was still steady. Nathan gave him that. Everything I did for this company, for your father. He built something, and I protected it. You stole from it, Victoria said. I maintained it. He said it like there was no contradiction. The contracts, the relationships, the board structure. None of that holds together without... Sandra Oren is in a rehabilitation facility, Victoria said. She's relearning how to walk. Something moved across Vaughn's face. It wasn't guilt. Nathan wasn't sure the man was capable of guilt in a conventional sense, but it was something. An acknowledgement, maybe, that this particular fact existed in a different category than the rest. That wasn't... He stopped. Wasn't what? Victoria said. Wasn't sanctioned? Wasn't part of your plan? She was not raising her voice. If anything, her voice had gotten quieter. She had a feeling, Damien. She sent me everything she had because she had a feeling, and 2 days later someone put her in a car's path. She looked at him. Was that Garrison? The name landed. 3 people at the table. Nathan clocked them. Crane, Aldous, and a 4th man whose role he didn't know reacted visibly to the name. Small reactions, controlled, but there. Vaughn said nothing. Mr. Vaughn, Marsh said, I'd ask you to stand, please. He didn't stand immediately. He sat at the end of the table and looked at his company, or the company he'd treated as his, and at the windows and the lake beyond them, and he looked for a moment like what he was, a man in his 60s who'd been building something for 25 years watching it end on a Wednesday morning. Then he stood. The agent behind Marsh moved forward. Vaughn put his wrists together in a gesture that was not submission exactly. It was more like acceptance, which was different, and the agent produced the restraints. Crane stood up before the agent reached him. I want my lawyer, he said, right now. I'm not saying a word without... That's your right, Marsh said. Please sit back down, Mr. Crane. Someone will assist you with that shortly. Aldous had not spoken. He was a thin man in his late 50s with the look of someone who'd spent a long time watching what other people decided before deciding himself. He was watching Vaughn be restrained, and his face was the face of a man calculating, even now, what the best position was. Nathan stayed near the door. Atlas sat beside him. The dog was watching the room with the same comprehensive attention he'd given the diner. Every body, every movement, the geometry of the space. One of the board members Nathan didn't know. A woman somewhere in her late 40s, who'd been sitting 3 seats to the left and had not been in the warrant documents, leaned toward the woman beside her and said something in a low voice. The second woman looked at Victoria with an expression that Nathan read as relief. There were people in this room who hadn't known or hadn't known enough. There usually were. Victoria was looking at Vaughn as the agents worked. Nathan watched her face. Whatever she was feeling wasn't simple enough to name from the outside. It was the face of someone standing on the far side of something they'd been afraid of for months and finding it different than they'd imagined. Not easier, not cleaner, just different. A second agent had gone around the table to Crane, who was making the specific kind of noise that men made when they were angry and frightened simultaneously, and had decided that loudness was their best option. Aldous was on his phone. Marsh was documenting with methodical efficiency. Cho was standing near the windows talking quietly into her own phone, looking out at the lake. The room was controlled chaos, which was different from the chaos of the diner. Slower, quieter, bureaucratic in the way that serious things eventually became bureaucratic. Nathan had always found the aftermath of operations more exhausting than the operations themselves, because the operations at least required full attention. The aftermath required patience. Vaughn walked past Nathan toward the door, flanked by an agent on either side. He was contained, composed, the suit still perfect, the silver hair in place. He was the kind of man who would remain composed, Nathan suspected, through arraignment and legal proceedings and whatever came after. See, not because he lacked feeling, but because composed was what he'd decided to be, and that decision had calcified over decades. But he stopped when he reached Nathan. The agent slowed beside him. He looked at Nathan, not with anger, with something more like curiosity. "You're not FBI," he said. "No." "Who are you?" "Nathan Mercer. Foundation work in Racine." Vaughn looked at him steadily. Then he looked down at Atlas, who was looking back up at him. "The dog from the diner," Vaughn said. "His name is Atlas." Vaughn absorbed that. Something moved in his expression again. The same thing that had moved when Victoria said Sandra Oren's name. Not guilt, something more like the recognition of a specific miscalculation. "We assessed you as low risk," he said. "I know. That was an error." "Yes," Nathan said. "It was." The agents moved Vaughn forward and out the door. Nathan watched him go and then turned back to the room. The next hour was paperwork and agents and phone calls and the specific exhausting machinery of law enforcement doing what it did when it finally got to do it. 2 more federal vehicles arrived. A forensic accountant appeared who Nathan hadn't seen before, with equipment in a case, and went directly to the conference room table and began working in a way that suggested she'd been waiting some time for access to these particular records. Victoria moved through it all with a steadiness that Nathan respected. She answered questions, signed documents, talked to Marsh at length about the chain of custody for the drive, talked to Cho about Sandra Oren's situation and what protections could be extended to her in the rehabilitation facility, and talked to 2 board members, the woman who'd leaned over during the arrests, and a man with reading glasses who'd been the quietest person in the room, about the company's immediate governance needs. At some point, Ruth had been right. 8 minutes was too long, but 6 hours had been enough. Around 7:45, the room had quieted enough that Nathan found a chair in the corner near the windows and sat in it. Atlas lay across his feet. Outside, the lake had gone from gray to something closer to blue as the morning solidified, and the city was becoming itself again. Traffic sounds from far below, the distant sound of someone's phone ringing in an adjacent office, the ordinary sounds of a building waking up. He texted Pam. "Running late. Long story. Home by noon." Then, thinking, he added, "Tell Lily the horse drawing worked." He didn't know exactly what he meant by that. Lily would probably know. Cho came and stood beside him. She was holding a coffee someone had produced from the break room down the hall, and she looked, for the first time all morning, like a person who was allowed to be tired. "The Garrison connection leads to 2 other companies," she said, "defense contractors. This is going to run for a while." "That's not my part," Nathan said. "No." She drank her coffee. "What's your part?" "Foundation work in Racine. I have a delivery I was supposed to be there for at 9. I'm going to miss it." Cho was quiet for a moment. "You could have walked away at the diner, or left after the county units arrived." "I know. Why didn't you?" Nathan thought about that. The true version was still complicated and still not something he talked about in rooms at 7 in the morning with federal agents. He thought about what he'd said to Victoria, about Sandra Oren, about what it meant when someone's work mattered and nobody came. He thought about Lily's drawing, which was still in his jacket pocket, slightly crumpled now. "I had a dog who needed to do his job," he said. "It would have been rude to leave early." Cho looked at Atlas. Atlas looked at the floor. "Right," she said. Victoria found him 20 minutes later when Marsh had released her from the immediate documentation process. She came and stood at the window and looked out at the lake for a moment before turning to him. She looked exhausted in the specific way that came after a long sustained effort finally ends. Not collapsed, but emptied out in a way that was actually closer to relief. "Marsh says it'll take most of the day before they'll let me go home," she said. "That's normal." "I know." She looked at her hands. She also said that once the preservation order is fully executed and the forensic team has what they need, the company can begin operating under temporary governance. She looked up. "Which means I'm still CEO." "Yes." I didn't know if that would... She stopped. I was afraid that even with everything, the board resolution might still... You walked in before the vote, Nathan said. The resolution was never called. I know, I just... She exhaled. I wanted to say it out loud. He understood that. Some things needed to be said out loud to become real. She looked at him. She'd been doing that periodically all morning, in the elevator, in the parking structure, during the arrests. And each time it was the same look, not easy to categorize. Not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was in it. Something more like the expression of a person who'd expected to be alone in something and hadn't been, and was still slightly recalibrating to that. What do you need right now? She asked. Is there anything? My truck is in the parking structure, he said. I need to get Atlas home. He needs his medication for the hip, and he only gets it twice a day, and we're coming up on the morning window. Victoria looked at Atlas. The dog was lying across Nathan's feet, breathing steadily, not asleep, but resting, eyes half closed, ears still doing their work. He's been doing that all morning, she said, just resting whenever he can. Yeah. Nathan looked down at him. He always knew how to do that better than me. She was quiet for a moment. Out the window, the lake was fully blue now, and the morning was fully morning, and from 42 floors up, the city looked like a thing that had always been exactly this way, and not like something that had been a different version of itself 6 hours ago. I'll have my assistant call you, she said, about the statement, for the federal record. I'll be in Racine, he said. Call the job site. She nodded. She looked like she was going to say something else. Something that would have been more than logistical, something that had been accumulating all morning in the space between the things they'd said to each other. He could see it forming. Nathan, she said. He waited. She looked at him. Whatever it was, she decided it was too large for the room, or the moment, or the morning, so she gave him what was true and sufficient. Thank you. He stood up. Atlas stood with him. Take care of the company, Nathan said, and make sure Sandra Oren has what she needs. He walked to the door. Atlas walked at his left heel, through the conference room that still smelled faintly of the morning's accounting and the hours of people talking, out into the corridor with its dark wood paneling and its brushed steel letters, past the receptionist desk where a young woman was now sitting with wide eyes looking at the remaining federal agents, to the elevator. He pressed the button for the parking structure. In the mirrored elevator walls, he looked at himself again. Still paint-stained, still unshaved, still the man who'd stopped at a roadside diner because he was tired and needed food, and happened to have a dog who knew what a room was before the room knew what it was. He looked at Atlas in the mirror. The dog looked back. The elevator descended. He made it home by 12:43. Not noon, as he'd told Pam, which meant Pam was already at the point where she'd stopped looking at the clock and started doing something else to manage the waiting. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, the way he'd sat in the diner parking lot the night before, except this time what he was absorbing was the specific ordinary beauty of his own house. A tan split level with a gutter that needed rehanging on the left side, and a flower bed his wife had planted 8 years ago that he maintained imperfectly and refused to remove. Atlas was asleep across the back seat. He'd been asleep since the parking structure in Chicago, which was the deepest sleep Nathan had seen the dog take in months. The hip medication had been 40 minutes late, and Nathan had apologized to the dog for it, which was the kind of thing he did when no one was around to witness it. The front door opened before he got out of the truck. Lily came down the porch steps at the velocity she always operated at, full speed, no intermediate gear, and crossed the front yard in approximately 4 seconds and hit him at hip height with enough force that he had to take a step back. "You said noon," she said into his jacket. "I know, I'm sorry. Pam made lunch without you." "That's fair. She made the soup you liked too, to be nice, even though she was annoyed." "That sounds like Pam." Lily pulled back and looked up at him. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, direct, the kind of eyes that didn't miss much. She was 6, but she had been watching people carefully since she was about 2, and the combination of that habit with her mother's eyes meant that she noticed things about Nathan's face that he didn't always want noticed. She was noticing something now. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired." "More tired than regular tired." Yes. She considered this with the seriousness she gave most things. Did something happen? He crouched down so he was at her level. Up close, she smelled like the peanut butter that Pam always let her have too much of, and she had a small marker stain on her left wrist that she hadn't noticed yet or didn't care about. Something happened, he said. Nothing bad. Just a long night. Did you help someone? He looked at her. He didn't know where she'd gotten that. Whether it was something she'd intuited, or something Pam had said at some point, or just the specific way that children sometimes identified the shape of things accurately without being able to explain how. Yeah, he said. I helped someone. She nodded like this explained everything, which maybe it did. Then she looked past him at the truck. Is Atlas okay? He's sleeping. He had a big night, too. He can sleep on my bed if he wants, she said. I'll let him, even though he makes the blanket smell. Nathan stood up. He put his hand on the top of her head, not ruffling, just resting there for a moment. She let him do it, which she didn't always because she had opinions about her hair. Go inside, he said. I'll be right in. Pam was at the kitchen table with a coffee and a crossword puzzle when he came through the back door, which was how she managed things she was moderately annoyed about, but not genuinely angry about. If she'd been genuinely angry, she'd have been standing. Long night, he said. So you mentioned in a text. She looked at him over her reading glasses. You look terrible. People keep saying that. It keeps being true. She got up and went to the stove and ladled soup into a bowl without asking if he wanted any, because she already knew, and because feeding people was how Pam Mercer expressed things that she didn't say directly. She set it in front of him and sat back down. Lily asked me 3 times when you were coming home. Twice last night and once this morning. I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me. She picked up her pen. I'm not the one who waited. He ate the soup. It was good. The kind of simple chicken soup that required time he never seemed to have, which meant Pam had made it from scratch, and that was its own kind of statement. It was something I couldn't walk away from, he said. Pam wrote something in her crossword. It always is. I mean, he stopped. A woman needed help. There wasn't anyone else. Pam looked at him over her glasses. She'd been his wife's older sister for long enough to have developed a very specific understanding of Nathan Mercer, his silences, his understatements, the particular way he described things at about 30% of their actual scale. Was anyone hurt? She asked. Not on our side. She absorbed that. Our side, she repeated. It's complicated. It always is. She went back to her crossword. Then, without looking up, she was lucky you were there. Maybe, Nathan said. Atlas deserves most of the credit. Pam looked at the dog, who had come inside and was now lying in the patch of sunlight that fell through the kitchen window every afternoon at this hour, his chin on his front paws, his eyes closed. He looks like he agrees with that, she said. Nathan slept for 4 hours that afternoon while Lily was at school, a flat and dreamless sleep that left him feeling like a different and slightly better version of himself when he woke at 4:15 to the sound of the school bus 2 streets over and Lily's footsteps on the porch. He lay in bed for a moment looking at the ceiling. The house had the sounds it always had, the refrigerator's hum, the particular creak of the 3rd porch step, Lily's voice saying something to Atlas, who'd apparently met her at the door. Ordinary sounds. The kind that you stopped hearing when you were inside them every day and only heard clearly when you'd been away from them long enough. He'd been away from them for 18 hours. That was long enough. His phone had 22 messages. He looked at them in rough order. 3 from his crew foreman at the Racine site. The delivery had been handled, no crisis, a note that said, "Hope everything's okay, boss," that Nathan appreciated more than he'd say. 2 from Detective Rourke, who wanted an expanded statement at his convenience. 1 from a number he didn't recognize with a Chicago area code, which he set aside. Several work messages that could wait. And 1, at 2:17 in the afternoon, from Cho. It said, Renata Voss apprehended at O'Hare at 11:40 a.m., attempting to board a flight to Zurich. Garrison CEO cooperating. Vaughn processed and remanded. Thought you'd want to know. He read it twice. Then he set the phone on the nightstand and got up. The weeks that followed moved at the pace that weeks move when you're pouring concrete and managing deliveries and getting a 6-year-old to school on time, which is to say they moved quickly while feeling simultaneously like the same day, repeated with small variations. Nathan gave his expanded statement to Rourke on a Thursday morning, sitting in a county office that smelled of old carpet and printer toner, and answered every question with the same calm completeness he'd given everything else. Rourke, at the end, looked at his notes and then at Nathan. "You know, there are people in this county who are going to say you should have stayed in your booth and called 911. "I know," Nathan said. "What do you say to that?" Nathan considered it honestly. "I say they're not wrong that it would have been the safer choice. For me." He paused. "It wasn't the right one for her." Rourke tapped his pen on his notepad. "For what it's worth, the FBI seems to share that view. Cho spoke well of you." "That's generous of her." "She's not a generous woman," Rourke said, "so take it at face value." The Chicago area code called back a week after that. It was a woman named Caroline who identified herself as Victoria Hale's executive assistant, calling to schedule a formal interview with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the evidentiary record. They found a date. He drove down to Chicago on a Tuesday, gave the interview, and drove back the same day. Victoria was not in the building when he was there. He didn't ask after her. Sandra Oren was transferred from the Sheboygan Rehabilitation Facility to a Better Resource Center in Milwaukee in the third week following the arrests, once the federal protective order was in place. Nathan read about it in a brief article in the Milwaukee Journal that described the case in broad strokes and referred to Hale Meridian's compliance officer only as a whistleblower whose identity was being protected. He read it twice and then set the paper down and went to finish the gutter repair he'd been putting off. He thought about her sometimes. A woman who'd had a feeling, who'd spent 22 years being very good at something unglamorous and exacting, who'd looked at 6 contracts in a company she worked for and seen something that the people around her either couldn't see or had chosen not to see, and had decided that what she saw mattered enough to act on even before she knew how dangerous that act was going to be. That was a kind of courage that didn't have a good name. It wasn't the dramatic kind, not running into a burning building, not pulling someone from a wreck. It was the kind that lived in spreadsheets and file transfers and the specific loneliness of being right about something that powerful people needed you to be wrong about. He hoped she could walk again. He didn't know if she could. He didn't have any way to find out that wasn't intrusive, and so he just hoped and moved on, which was all he knew how to do with hope in most cases. 6 weeks after the arrests, on a Saturday in late October with the trees in full turn and the temperature back to the reasonable side of cold, Nathan drove to the Racine County Veterans Services office for a meeting he'd been putting off for 3 months. It was a small office in a municipal building, staffed by 2 people who knew what they were doing and didn't waste anyone's time. He sat across from a woman named Greta, who had his file and went through it with the same forensic thoroughness that Sandra Oren had probably brought to freight contracts. And at the end of it, Greta said that he'd been leaving money on the table, and also that she was going to connect him with a peer support group that met on Wednesday evenings if he was interested. He said he'd think about it. He went back the following week and told Greta he was interested. These were not dramatic decisions. They didn't feel like turning points from inside them. They just felt like the next right thing, done at the right time, which was often how the most important things felt when you were actually inside them and not looking back at them later trying to find the moment everything changed. On a Thursday afternoon in the second week of November, Nathan was in the truck outside Lily's school when his phone rang. The number was Victoria's direct line. Caroline had texted it to him after the evidentiary interview, noting that Ms. Hale had asked her to pass it along in case the U.S. Attorney's Office needed to coordinate. He hadn't used it. He answered. "I'm interrupting something," she said immediately. She had the particular quality of knowing when she'd called at a complicated moment that he hadn't heard from her before, which meant she'd gotten better at reading people, or had always been good at it, and he hadn't had the context to see it. "School pickup in 4 minutes," he said. "I have time." "I'll be quick." A pause, and he could hear in the background of her call the ambient sound of an office, keyboards, a distant voice, the particular texture of a large floor in motion. The board approved a governance restructure last week. New audit committee, independent oversight. We're also restructuring 3 of the 6 federal contracts to remove the margin structures Sandra identified. That's good. It's not fast enough. Some of it won't resolve for months, legally, but it's moving. Another pause. We're also establishing a foundation for retired working dogs and their handlers, veterans in particular. She said it straightforwardly, without making it a presentation. It's not named after Atlas. I thought that would be, I don't know, too much. It would be too much, Nathan agreed. It's called the Working Dog Legacy Fund. We're partnering with 3 veteran service organizations to fund medical care, retirement placement, and handler support. Her voice had a quality he recognized from the storage room in the diner. That careful steadiness of someone who'd decided something that mattered and wasn't going to undercut it by being emotional about it out loud. Sandra helped design the program criteria. By phone, from the rehabilitation center, she insisted. Nathan looked out the windshield at the school's front doors. Parents were starting to accumulate at the pickup line. A woman 2 cars ahead was eating something out of a container and reading her phone, and a man behind him was doing something with his dashboard that involved a lot of frustrated gestures. "How is she?" he asked. "Better. She's walking with a cane. Her doctor says she may not need it in 3 months, or she may need it longer. They're not making promises." A brief pause. "She asked me to tell you something," she said, and I'm quoting, "Tell the man with the dog that it wasn't wasted." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Tell her I said the same to her," he said. The school doors opened. He could see Lily in the second cluster of kids. She was easy to spot because she moved faster than most of the other children and had a backpack that was decorated with stickers she'd applied herself, which made it look like a small explosion. "I also want to offer you something," Victoria said, "and I want you to hear the whole thing before you respond." "Okay." "I want to bring someone in to manage security operations for the company. Not the kind of security we had. Not private contractors with no accountability. Someone who understands institutional integrity and how to protect it without compromising it. Someone with the specific kind of judgment that I now know exists and I don't want to operate without." A pause. "I'm offering you that position. The salary is serious. You'd have flexibility on location. We have a regional office in Milwaukee. You wouldn't have to be in Chicago full-time unless you wanted to be." He watched Lily cross the pickup lane, scanning cars, and then find his truck and start toward it at the particular half-run she used when she was trying to look like she wasn't running. "You built what you built without me," he said. "I lost most of it without you," she said, "and got it back with you. That distinction feels relevant." "You'd have found another way." "Maybe." She didn't argue it too hard. "But I didn't. This is the way that happened." Lily knocked on the passenger window. Nathan reached across and unlocked the door, and she climbed in with her backpack and the immediacy of a child who had many things to report about the day and couldn't decide which one came first. "I need to let you go," Nathan said into the phone. "I know. You don't have to decide now. Take whatever time." "I'm not going to take the position," he said. "But thank you. It's a real offer, and I know it is." A pause. "Can I ask why?" He looked at Lily, who had gotten her backpack off and was now examining the sticker situation on the front pocket and adding a mental note about additions. She had not yet noticed he was on the phone. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 6. She needs someone to be here when she gets out of school, and someone to make dinner that isn't soup from a can, and someone to read the 3rd book even when the first 2 were enough." He paused. "I spent a long time doing work that required me to be somewhere else. I don't want to do that anymore." Victoria was quiet. He couldn't read the quality of the quiet. It was too full. "That's a good reason," she said finally. "It's the only one I've got." "Daddy," Lily said, having noticed him. "Are you on the phone?" "1 second," he told her. Then to Victoria, "Anything comes up that actually requires what I can do. Not a job, not a role, just something that matters. You have my number." "I know," she said. "I won't abuse it." "I know you won't." Another pause. And then, and he'd remember this later, not as something she said, but as something she didn't say, the space where something large existed and was allowed to stay large without being reduced to words. "Take care of yourself, Nathan, and take care of that dog." "I will," he said. "Good luck with the company." He ended the call. Lily was looking at him with the expression that meant she had assessed the tone of the conversation and was in the process of deciding what it meant. "Who was that?" she said. "Someone I helped, a while back." Lily considered this. "Is she okay now?" He started the truck. "Getting there." "Good," Lily said, and accepted this as sufficient, and went back to the sticker question. He drove home through the middle of the afternoon traffic, which was not heavy but had the distracted quality of people running errands, thinking about things other than the road. He drove at a steady, careful pace because Lily was in the car, and also because he'd been driving carefully his entire life when it mattered, and he wasn't about to change that. 3 weeks after that call, on a Saturday when the temperature had come all the way down to the kind of cold that committed to itself, Nathan drove to the diner. He didn't plan to. He was driving back from a supply run for the Racine site, came to the highway exit, and found himself taking it without having decided to. The parking lot was the same cracked asphalt. The sign was the same faded red letters. The fluorescent light above the entrance had stopped flickering. Someone had fixed it or replaced it, and now it just burned steady and uninteresting. He sat in the cab for a moment. Atlas lifted his head from the passenger seat. "Yeah," Nathan said, "I know." They went inside. Ruth was at the counter with the same silver braid and the same reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, pouring coffee for a trucker at the far stool. She looked up when the door opened. She looked at Nathan. She looked at Atlas. She set the coffee pot down. "I told you not to bring whatever that was back with you," she said. "It's just us," Nathan said. "No, whatever that was." She looked at him for another moment, then at the last booth. "Go sit down. I'll bring coffee." He sat in the same booth, facing the door. Atlas lay under the table and put his head on Nathan's boot. The diner was quieter than it had been that night. 3 tables occupied, all ordinary, all with the ordinary sounds of people eating and talking at a volume that wasn't covering anything. The truckers at the counter ate their eggs with focused efficiency. A family in the 4th booth had a young child who was explaining something complicated about a cartoon to 2 adults who were listening with the specific patience of people who'd heard about this cartoon many times. Ruth brought 2 coffees and a bowl of water for Atlas without being asked. "How's your hip?" she said to the dog. It was addressed to the dog. Atlas looked up at her. His tail moved once on the floor. "Better," Nathan said, on the dog's behalf. Ruth straightened up. She stood at the edge of the table and looked at Nathan with the look of someone who'd been around long enough to not need a lot of words to communicate a lot of things. "The news said something about it," she said. "The company thing, the arrests." She paused. "Said a roadside diner in the county." "That's about right." "Didn't say anything about the dog." "No," Nathan said. "It didn't." Ruth looked at Atlas again. "He should have gotten some credit." "He knows he did good," Nathan said. "That's enough for him." She nodded, like this was philosophically acceptable. She picked up the coffee pot. "You eating?" "Patty melt," he said, "and fries." She wrote it down. She walked back toward the kitchen. Halfway there, she turned around. "The woman," she said, "the one in the booth with the bag. She doing all right?" "Yeah," Nathan said. "She's doing all right." Ruth nodded again and went to put the order in. He sat with his coffee and looked out the window at the parking lot and the highway beyond it. It was afternoon, not midnight, and everything looked different in the flat November light. Smaller, less charged, ordinary in the way that places are ordinary when they're not the backdrop to something. Just cracked asphalt and a state road and the specific gray of a Midwest November sky that wasn't threatening anything, just being gray. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who wasn't noticed, not invisible. That was the wrong word, because Atlas had been seen, had been assessed and dismissed, which was not the same as not being seen. It was something else. It was the specific quality of looking like you belonged in the background of things, like you were the set dressing and not the event. Nathan had spent most of his adult life being that. Before the Navy, he'd been a quiet kid from a small town in central Wisconsin who wasn't remarkable in any way that the world had a system for measuring. In the Navy, and after, the work had required it. You did not want to be the person a room organized itself around if your job was to understand the room before the room understood you. And then after the work, in the years of Lily's early childhood, and the grief that had lived in the house alongside them, like a 4th family member nobody talked about. He'd been unremarkable because remarkable required energy he didn't have. People overlooked him because he didn't argue with being overlooked. He'd never been sure whether that was wisdom or just a habit that had outlived its reasons. But here was what he'd come to think, in the weeks since that night, in the quiet of the mornings before Lily woke up when he sat with his coffee and Atlas at his feet, and the house doing its ordinary sounds around them. The world had a tendency to measure courage by how loud it was, by how visible, by whether it showed up in an article or a statement or a ceremony where someone handed you something in front of other people. Sandra Oren had worked in quiet for 22 years. She'd seen something and acted on it before she knew the cost, which was the only kind of courage that was actually real, because the kind you performed once you knew an audience was watching was something else entirely. She'd had a feeling. She'd put everything on a drive. She was relearning to walk and had used her time in a rehabilitation center to help design a foundation for working dogs and the people who'd worked beside them. Nobody would make a film about Sandra Oren. She'd be a footnote in the legal case, a whistleblower whose name a protective order would keep out of most of the public record. She would go back to forensic accounting, probably, when she was able. She would continue being very good at something unglamorous and exacting, in rooms that didn't organize themselves around her, and the work she did would matter in ways that nobody would fully trace back to her, which was how most important work actually moved through the world. He thought about Atlas, who had crossed a diner floor in absolute silence at midnight and stopped something terrible from happening, and had then gone to sleep in the parking structure of a federal building because the moment was over and sleeping was what you did when the moment was over. Who had walked into the boardroom on a hip that hurt in the cold and sat in the corner while humans sorted out what humans needed to sort out. Who was currently lying under a diner table with his head on Nathan's boot, breathing slow, not performing anything. The food came. He ate. The family in the fourth booth finished and left. The child waved at Atlas on the way out, unprompted, and Atlas's tail moved once on the floor in acknowledgement. Outside, the sky was doing something in the west. Not a sunset yet, just the light changing quality, the gray acquiring a faint warmth at the edges that would be gone in 20 minutes. Nathan watched it through the window while he finished his coffee. He thought about the position Victoria had offered, about what it would have been, the salary she'd called serious, the flexibility on location, the work of building something clean out of something that had been dirty. It had been a real offer. She'd meant it, and he knew she'd meant it, and there was a version of himself that might have taken it. That version was younger and less sure about which things were actually the most important, and had not yet spent enough years understanding that the things that held you to the world were mostly small, and that small was not the same as insufficient. Lily at 3:45 in the pickup line, running because she was happy to see him, pretending she wasn't running because she was 6, and dignity was beginning to matter. The third book at bedtime when she'd already had 2, and he was tired and she wasn't, and the specific satisfaction of reading it anyway because the deal they had was that the story always finished. The marker stain on her wrist she hadn't noticed. The horse drawing in his jacket pocket that he'd transferred to his bureau drawer, where he had a small collection of her drawings going back to when she was 3, in a folder he'd never mentioned to anyone. These things held him, not to a location or a job or a version of himself that the world had a name for, just to the actual texture of being alive on a particular day, in a particular house, with a particular child who'd inherited her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of watching things carefully. That was what he was protecting. It had always been what he was protecting, in every room and every situation and every job he'd ever done, including the ones with more paperwork and less concrete. He left Ruth a tip that was too large, which he always did, and said goodbye, and she said don't bring the whatever back, which was her version of the same thing. He clipped Atlas's leash in the parking lot, not because the dog needed it, but because of habit, and because some habits were worth keeping. Atlas walked to the truck at a steady pace. The hip was better, not fixed. It would never be entirely fixed, but better, which was a reasonable outcome for a 9-year-old working dog who'd had a long career and had not yet decided it was over. Nathan drove home. The highway was clear, and the afternoon was fading at the edges, and the heater in the truck was finally working the way it was supposed to, which was a relief after the better part of 2 weeks of it being inconsistent. Atlas was asleep in the passenger seat before they reached the first exit. He drove at a steady, careful pace. He thought about nothing in particular, and then about Lily, and then about what he was going to make for dinner, and then about the gutter on the left side of the house that still needed full replacement rather than just re-hanging, and about the Wednesday evening meeting he was going to try next week, and about whether it would snow before Thanksgiving and what Lily would say if it did. He did not think about whether he'd made the right choices. He was too tired for that, and also he already knew the answer, which was that right choices rarely felt like choices from inside them. They just felt like the next thing that needed doing, done by the person who happened to be there. He had been there. Atlas had been there. That was the whole story, and it was enough, and the road home was clear. And he took it.